We are back right now live on the Cheap Heat Productions Network with another very, very interesting interview. My name is Jack Kilby, No Gimmicks Guy on the socials. And I'm pleased today to welcome a man who is a nationally known journalist, works for ESPN. He's covered all manner of combat sports, football, wrestling, and he's come out with a book that I'm personally looking forward to reading. Although coming from the vintage where I saw the NWO live and tearing it up during the Monday Night Wars, there's a lot to learn from this book, and it is called Say Hello to the Bad Guys: How Professional Wrestling's New World Order Changed America. And of course, I'm here with the author of that book, Mr. Marc Raimondi. Marc, thank you for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Jack. Happy to hang out with you today.
I guess it makes sense from the start to ask you what inspired you to focus on this particular topic, and how did your background as not only a lifelong fan but an ESPN journalist shape how you approach telling the NWO story in 2025?
It's actually a unique story. So it was not initially my idea to do this book, believe it or not. It was not initially my idea. So I used to cover the UFC for ESPN and other outlets, and I did that for 11 years. And in 2021, I got an email from someone who said that they were an editor at Simon & Schuster, the publishing house, one of the biggest in the world. And they were asking me if I wanted to write a book about the NWO. And now, of course, the first thing that I thought, Jack, was, well, this is a scam. This is not real. There's no way this could be true. What a crazy email to get. I was sitting in Houston, Texas in a hotel room covering, a UFC fight week. And I get that email. So I do some Googling, to see if this person is legit. It turns out they are. And what happened was I had written about the NWO going into the WWE Hall of Fame back in 2019. So about a year and a half earlier. And the editor there saw that not only did I write that story, but I kind of overwrote that story. I wrote it with kind of a different passion that you would think of just writing a simple story about someone going to a Hall of Fame. And I did that because it meant something to me, right? I was 11 when the NWO started. It was a formative time in my life. I remember vividly, Hogan turning heel and so on and so forth. So that was how it all came together. And within a few minutes, really, of getting that email, I was on the phone with this editor, and we were talking, and we really vibed right away. We kind of both shared a vision of what the NWO was, what it did for culture, wrestling in general, and how that has impacted culture. And then it was just kind of off to the races. That's how it all came together.
Wow, you're right. That is quite the unusual but fortuitous story.
Yeah.
The formation of the NWO was such a pivotal moment in wrestling history, and for those fans that maybe weren't around when it happened, can you talk about just how the rise of the faction, because of course there were factions before in wrestling, many of them, the Four Horsemen, etc. But what was it about the coming together of Hall, Nash, and then the Big Bash at the Beach angle when Hogan turned heel that was so revolutionary at the time?
There were obviously factions, like you said before. The Four Horsemen were a really big one in the late 80s and into the 90s and beyond, really. But the NWO kind of became a whole entity unto itself. And there were so many elements that converged with Hall and Nash taking the risk, leaving the WWF where they were, getting paid well and they were pushed as top acts, and going to WCW while still in their primes. And then Hulk Hogan taking a risk and turning heel after about a decade of success, with Hulkamania. Now, certainly the Hulkamania fad was waning, right? But it's no cinch that he was going to be able to turn heel and do what he ended up doing. So you had those factors together. And then just riding the wave of what the 90s became with counterculture and anti-heroes and the villain becoming the protagonist, and really riding that wave, really, and also setting the pace in some cases as well with the things they were doing that were grittier, edgier than we would see in wrestling. And because of that, it was a revolution of what wrestling programming looked like. Because before, it was very cartoony. The violence was very cartoony, the characters were very cartoony, and the NWO became this very real, very gritty, guys using their real names, backstage beatdowns, weapons being used. Some of the things they were doing were really special. And no one had really seen that before in a wrestling context. And then it forced Vince McMahon to then change his strategy and get a little edgier. And then he got a lot edgier in the late 90s with the Attitude Era. So the NWO, if that does not happen, I'm not sure where 90s wrestling would end up being. And I'm not sure where wrestling would be today.
Mm-hmm. When you look at WCW, early 90s WCW, it was a much maligned time period. I don't think necessarily correctly, but pretty straight up product. They were, trying to imitate in a lot of ways McMahon. And then you go over in the other channel, and it was a real downturn in the product with the overly cartoony, employment character presentations. Do you think that situation where it was so cartoonish, do you think that laid or contributed to the NWO being as impactful when it debuted as it was?
Absolutely, because if you're watching the NWO and WCW on TNT in the States, and then you turn the channel to USA Network where Raw was playing, you were seeing guys like TL Hopper, the wrestling plumber, who just debuted right in the same time as the NWO. You saw the Goon, the wrestling hockey player, coming out with his hockey stick in his hockey jersey, and like the Body Donnas, Skip and Zip, the wrestling fitness instructors, or the wrestling hog farmers, Henry Godwin and Phineas. I mean, it was a stark contrast from what Nitro was looking like by mid to late 96 to what Raw was looking like, where it was still very much a cartoon, and Nitro had kind of taken things to a different level of violence. When Kevin Nash powerbombed Eric Bischoff off of the stage through a table, that was a really big signal that this is not going to be your typical wrestling storyline. This is going to be something very different and much more impactful, because you had never really seen that violence against a non-wrestler before, an announcer. No one was putting Gordon Soley through a table before that. You know what I mean? And so that was a really big, kind of foreshadowing for the future.
Absolutely. Your book also argues that something we don't see in the same context today, but the NWO really changed American pop culture, and I would argue, other, like, certainly in Canada, we had a similar sort of phenomenon happening. Can you share a specific example of how your research established that the NWO's influence extended beyond wrestling into the mainstream culture?
Yeah, so the hypothesis of the entire book is that the NWO started the 90s wrestling boom in the States and in Canada, right? Where at its peak, we're talking about more than 10 million people watching wrestling every Monday night between Raw and Nitro, buying, billions of dollars worth of merchandise, video games, t-shirts, and what have you. It was truly it truly captured the zeitgeist of culture, right? It was part of pop culture in the 90s. You couldn't go anywhere. I grew up in Queens, New York, and you couldn't go out to the mall without seeing an Austin 316 t-shirt or an NWO t-shirt or something, or DX, or you couldn't, you're gonna see the crotch chop. I mean, it really became part of the cultural lexicon, in a way that wrestling had not, at least at that level nationally. Sure, certainly there was very popular wrestling regionally all over the country, and in Canada, of course, as well. But on a national level, where we're talking about, you almost had to be watching Raw and Nitro to go to school the next day, because that's what everyone's going to be talking about. So you need to make sure that you're up to speed on what is happening. And I'm sure that probably happened in offices and college campuses and high schools and middle schools and whatnot. So the whole hypothesis, Jack, is that it was so indoctrinated into the culture in the 90s, and most of the people that were watching it were young men, again, middle school, preteen, teen, 20s, 30s, And now everyone has grown up, and now we're all in our 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and we're part of the workforce, and we're kind of millennials, I guess, that generation, a little bit of Gen X, now kind of make the country go. And that was a big part of our childhoods. And the only way that you can really touch culture and impact culture is by touching and impacting the people that are in the culture, right? You have to touch the people, and then the people spread it. And I think that is what happens when you look at what is going on in the United States, especially with the kind of rise of manufactured conflict being so, reality television and you know, cable news where it's just pundits, talking back and forth, arguing and basically cutting wrestling promos on each other every night on CNN or whatever. And in sports, the same thing. The biggest sports shows are all these talking head shows and pundits and wrestling, and people really probably putting on personas and characters. And social media, I would argue, is the same thing. Everyone is playing a persona that's not their real, who they really are. And I think that all that stuff comes from the 90s and the wrestling boom, because that's what we all grew up on, and that's what we all knew, and then we passed down to other generations as well. And then finally, of course, politics. I mean, Donald Trump is the president of the United States. He's in WWE Hall of Fame. I mean, he's in the Hall of Fame, and he's been involved with wrestling for a very long time. Vince McMahon is still one of his closest friends, and he got elected, I would argue, based on the fact that he was so good at talking to crowds and manipulating the audience, and getting a rise out of people in that way, that I feel comes very much from pro wrestling. And I interviewed Andrew Yang, who was a presidential candidate a few years ago, and he backed that up 100%. He said that it would benefit people to learn more about pro wrestling to understand the rise of Trump. And Yang himself told me that when he was going out and doing speeches during his campaign, he would psych himself up and say to himself, all right, I gotta put on my best pro wrestling promo now. He was a wrestling fan growing up, so he's a perfect example of someone who took watching wrestling as a kid and brought it over to what he did, which was politics. And that is how I think that wrestling boom started by the NWO has changed America.
Yeah, you also interviewed some really key figures: Hogan, Bischoff, Nash, and
I actually did not interview Hogan or Nash. I tried, but they were unavailable to me. I did interview Bischoff.
okay. So Bischoff is a good example of a guy that they're workers. You don't know. I was going to specifically cite Hogan for that, but you're interviewing and you're trying to get to the heart of the matter. How did you approach your interview with such a master worker, and did you get any surprising insights from any of the individuals that you did not know going in that you knew before?
Really, just the same way that I would approach any interview. I mean, I've been a journalist for 20 years now, so it's been my entire adult life. So I've interviewed countless people, from all different walks of life, from star NFL players to Conor McGregor and Mike Tyson and guys like that. So really, I mean, wrestling is different, as you've noted, because sometimes the goal is to manipulate and the goal is to kind of work you, so to speak. But I didn't find any of that so much in this, because I came at it very earnestly and I did all of my research, right? So that before I even interviewed anyone, really, I watched over 500 hours of WCW. And that was really important to me, because I needed to have a working knowledge of that while I was interviewing people, because memories can fade, and people, unknowingly and not without realizing, they're not lying, but they're misremembering something, especially when it's almost 30 years ago. And that was a crazy time period in their lives where they were going from city to city on the regular, traveling, drinking a lot, using some drugs, you know what I mean? So the memory is not sharp. So I needed to know everything beforehand. And I took copious notes as I watched 500 hours of WCW, and I took copious notes going into interviews. So I had, all my ducks in a row. So if someone said something, I could say, well, actually, that didn't happen that day. It happened this day. Could you remember that? And I had to kind of, you know what I mean? So that was kind of a big part of the interview process. And I did interview almost 100 people, for the book, from, wrestlers to behind the scenes folks, producers, engineers, camera people, merchandise people, marketing people, and so on. So, yeah, really just kind of leaning on my journalistic background for that type of stuff. And, you know, People are going to probably lie to me. I understand that it's wrestling, right? But I try my best to cut through, to the truth, and also give alternate. If someone said this, I need to have someone else kind of, either corroborating that or going against it, so I can have the whole story there.
Yeah, makes sense. You sort of touched on how the NWO really blurred the lines between fiction and reality, and
Mhm.
broke the fourth wall, so to speak, to the point where there's that famous scene, for lack of a better word, in the back lot where
Mhm.
the NWO
Yep.
attacked, and Rey Mysterio got thrown against the trailer like a dart by Nash. So, um, do you have an understanding about why, given the fact that the product was so different, that it really resonated in the '90s in particular, and actually made pro wrestling, as you talked upon, socially acceptable, or even cool for a number of years?
Yeah, so the 90s, things were changing very much in the 90s from a cultural standpoint. So the 80s was very much a kind of a positive, happy decade with prosperity from an economic standpoint. Music was kind of happy and poppy, and the power ballads, and early '90s to late '80s, like the back, not the Backstreet Boys, the New Kids on the Block, and kind of like boy bands and that type of stuff. And that was what was popular. It was kind of a positive. Every movie had like a hero, like Rambo, or the Schwarzenegger movies, and action movies were big, and it was like these big epics like and Star Wars, and there was very much the good and the evil, right? There was very much and the Hulkamania was like that very much too. To tie to wrestling, Hulkamania was very much like here's the good guy, the blonde, blue haired, all American good guy going up against like the evil foreign powers. And uh things definitely shifted a lot in the 90s. And my feeling is that it was a lot of because what was going on in current events. And the US there was some terrorist attacks. The Oklahoma City bombing was in the early 90s. There was an attack on the World Trade Center in the early 90s. And what you were consuming on television became different as cable grew. And that extended to like court TV was showing the Menendez trial. The Menendez brothers killed their parents, and that was on television like every day. And people watched that. Like, it was reality. It was like people were escaping their own reality, but also, watching someone else's reality. And it almost became, reality became theater in a sense. And then right after that was the O.J. Simpson trial. And I remember, Jack, like watching the O.J. Simpson trial every day with my mom. It was like during the summer, as far as I remember. And I was home from school, and my mom had that on court TV every day. And we're watching this courtroom drama that's 100% real. And it was a new way for people to kind of consume content, because it was real to an extent, and reality TV to the real world. And that was kind of like a staged reality. And I equate that to wrestling. Wrestling is kind of like a staged reality where everyone kind of knows it's not 100% real. There are some elements of truth, but mostly it's scripted. And then that cultural shift, which also saw the rise of music like gangster rap, NWA, Dr. Dre, and those folks, Ice Cube, and then Marilyn Manson, Nirvana, grunge. That was a whole different vibe, counterculture. Darker, grittier, more urban than the 80s, right? And then the NWO to me is just a part of that. You can throw the NWO with any of that stuff, with gangster rap, with the feelings of the country, the anti-hero, the rebelliousness, where it wasn't we had kind of lost our innocence to an extent as a country, and the NWO was there as this villainous anti-hero group where they were going up against the establishment, so there was kind of like some relatable thing to them, but they were doing it in a very bad way and violent, way. But there was something compelling about that, going up against the establishment that they had. And I think that, goes hand in hand with all those things that I spoke about as being part of kind of the fabric of the culture in the mid 90s.
The NWO aesthetic, we talk a lot about the black and white, the t-shirts. I mean, talk about a ubiquitous, ever present phenomenon. Even to this day, I'm sure they sell well. And then those promos with the black and white, the cut, the sharp cuts, the music, the old porno music, et cetera, et cetera. How did their branding contribute to their impact? And did you, when you're doing your research, uncover anything about the creative process behind that?
I did quite a bit, actually, quite a bit. That's a good question. So the branding, I mean, just like anything else, branding is so key and so important. And a lot of what happened with the NWO was kind of by accident, in a way. It was not necessarily something that was a strategic plan from the jump. It was very much, there wasn't a lot of communication between Eric Bischoff and what his plans were going to be past. He was just trying to get Hogan to turn and have that moment, right? And then everything else, he had a plan for what was going to come next, but he did not share that plan with the marketing department or the merchandising department or, you know, PR. You know, there was no preparation from that standpoint from the, you know, the I guess like the support systems of WCW, right? The things that, you know, help make a promotion go. So when that happened at Bash at the Beach, everyone started scrambling because they knew it was a big deal because the crowd reacted like it was a massive deal. So it was huge, and they knew they had something, and they had to just jump into action right away. And one of the probably one of the things that I'm most proud of in the book is I was able to track down the woman who designed the logo, who no one knew who she was for over 20 years. No one had any clue who she was. And I was interviewing Neil Pruitt, who was he was a producer at WCW who did like features and like vignettes, and he was responsible for a lot of the look and the feel of those early promos. He's also the voice of the NWO, like in their entrance music, and you know, really a crucial figure to like the vibe of the NWO, how it was presented on screen. An underrated guy in that way too, I think. So when I was interviewing him, he was like, "You really have to try to track down the person who did the logo." And I was confused because I thought I knew that story, but it turns out that I didn't. So what happened was, because of the Summer Olympics in 1996, WCW was not home in Atlanta. There were no production trucks, and they were based in Atlanta. So they were doing everything out of the Orlando area, mostly at Disney MGM Studios, which was like kind of their second home. They had like a, you know, a setup there where they did tapings of shows. So that's where they were immediately after Bash at the Beach. They went right to Orlando. So they didn't have access to, you know, their whatever, you know, people or office that would do logos then, they didn't have access to it. So they had to go to an office, a post-production office at Disney MGM Studios. And it was basically three producers that went there. It was Craig Leathers, Annette Yother, and Rob Wright. And they went to the studio, and by the way, Rob Wright and Craig Leathers just don't remember had no idea who this person was. You know, 30 years later or whatever, they had no idea who this person was. They gave me like a description, but they didn't know what her name was or anything. So they went to this post production studio and they were told, okay, we have like one person here who can do a logo, and WCW was like, all right, we need something like in an hour. You know, just let's just get something together real quick. And Craig Leathers brought with him a few ideas, you know, because he had been kind of going to stores like convenience stores, looking at magazines, trying to see something that would give kind of a similar vibe to what the NWO, looking at like skater magazines, heavy metal, like, you know, rap, you know, hip hop magazines, and trying to kind of get a vibe that could look, you know, make it a logo to look like what the NWO was. So he had some ideas, and basically he was kind of saying, hey, this is kind of one of my ideas. And you know, this woman was putting it down on, you know, the computer. And that was that was really it. You know, in a very short amount of time, she created this logo, and then they took the logo, took it to Bischoff, and he said, okay, but no one remembered who she was. She was like lost to time until I tracked her down. And it was very hard to track her down. I had to kind of tap into my reporting skills a little bit, you know, and it took me a few weeks, you know, to find her, but I finally did. And I texted her, I cold texted her, and because I found her number, And I told her, "Hi, I'm Mark. I'm writing this book. I know this is a random question, but does this logo mean anything to you?" And I texted her like a JPEG of the logo, and she wrote back, and 30 minutes later, yes, I designed it. And I was like, I found her. I found her. So that's in the book. That whole story is in the book, and that was a big part of getting the NWO off the ground. Then they had to start making T-shirts, and they had to start marketing it in a inventive way, and they did a great job with that too, because they were selling, like, so you've been to like concerts and events where you're walking up to the stadium or the arena, and there are people like on the street selling like bootleg shirts, right? Not real licensed shirts, but like the fake stuff. So they actually did that for the NWO. They went outside and made it seem like folks were selling bootleg shirts when really it was legitimately licensed WCW merchandise, but they did not let that on. They made it seem like people were selling NWO shirts on the street, like counterfeit. I thought that was a great touch, like just a great touch. And even the merchandise catalog, and this is like, for younger folks, like you couldn't just go to WWE shop. You need to get like a catalog in the mail and then call them up, So they actually printed separate WCW and NWO catalogs, and the phone number and the address for both were different. They were going to the same place. It was all WCW, but they still preserved like the kayfabe nature of the group, that it was an invasion, that it was two separate things. And I thought that was just really smart to do, and people really like latched onto that. And there were people that really believed that the NWO was invading, and I think that the efforts of WCW really played a part in that.
Before I get to a fan question, you kind of jogged my memory about something. I think a lot of the NWO's appeal was the fact that folks were saying wrestling is predetermined, but that looks real, and
Right.
that element of danger to it that kept audiences for a very long time tuning in. Do you think that the way that the product is presented today, with not only kayfabe dead, but WWE is having a show where they're stripping like everything down for everybody to consume, and it's always in the fans' face that this is a work, and it makes it so hard to suspend disbelief. Do you think they've lost something by moving away from that approach that made the NWO so successful, or can we just not pull that off anymore, 30 years later?
I see both sides to it. I do understand the old school mentality of trying to protect the business, so to speak, and try to, preserve kayfabe. But I do feel like that is the toothpaste is out of the tube, so to speak, and you can't put it back in. Like those days are over. I'm not sure about a show that just reveals everything. I mean, I think that there should be, excuse me, the preservation of some of like the magic of how these things happen. I do think that's healthy, because I guess there are behind the scenes type of things in other shows, other entertainment mediums, but wrestling is different. It's not the same as other entertainment mediums. And I'm not sure if you need that. Now, I will save my like full opinion before before I see the show. I don't want to I don't know what the show is going to be. So I want to see it before I give a an assessment of it. But I definitely do see the erosion of kayfabe. Now, you can use that in your favor to an extent. There are things that can still capture kind of pop culture. But the John Cena heel turn did, because they were able to keep that insulated from everyone very well. And I thought that broke through a lot. And I thought they could have done more with it, but they just didn't. They didn't really tap into that whole thing as well as they could have. The way the NWO did, where it became like the entire focus of the show. But it's just hard to say. It's just hard to say what, because I mean, kids now grow up knowing that it's not real. When I was young, watching in the early '90s, I did think it was. I was like a 5-year old, 6-year old. I did think it was real, and now they're very in your face about saying like, "Hey, this is all scripted." So I guess time will tell. It certainly hasn't. Look, put it this way: it has not hurt WWE's business. WWE's business is booming right now, and they're going to continue riding that as long as they can. And you know I think my final kind of thought on that is I do dislike the stigma that people have, which a lot of people have about wrestling, is that it's fake, right? That's kind of like that's like the go-to phrase for non-fans to kind of mock you for being a wrestling fan. I'm sure you've heard it yourself, Jack.
Many, many
Canadians
times.
are Canadians are very nice, but they're probably not immune from stuff like that. But and I hate that, and I hate that because it's such a missing the point. It's just it's so off base because okay, I mean, yes, it's scripted television, just like almost everything else you're watching on television. However, it is live, stunts and real injuries and fake is just not the right word. You're it's a very basic kind of and insulting way to describe what people do, which I believe is an art.
Mhm.
So I guess what I'm getting at is like if you do kind of open the curtain and you're more forthcoming about wrestling and what it takes and what goes into wrestling and how hard it is to do, I think that is for the betterment of the product. But you have to make sure that you do that. If you're gonna continue to pull the curtain back, you have to make sure people know like, hey, these men and women are putting their bodies on the line every single week and they're risking injury, paralysis, death, like literally on a day-to-day basis, and that needs to be more known. Like, it's fake, okay, it's scripted, but boy, those impacts that they're putting on their body time and time and time again, there's nothing fake about that, and that stuff adds up, and one slip, 1 inch here and there, and it's a life-altering injury, and people need to realize that these are talented athletes who pull off the impossible on a regular basis.
Yeah, I see where you're coming from for sure, and I don't want to sound like Ole Anderson, but I think we're losing some of the magic by
Hmm.
having absolutely everything out there. And then there's the
Yeah.
argument we won't get into about wrestlers, putting everything out on social media and et cetera, et cetera. But I think
Mhm.
you're also very right that the toothpaste is out of the tube and it's not going back in. Fan wanted me to ask you, being an NWO expert, one of the topics that's really debated a lot is Hogan's role in the formation of the NWO and putting the
Mhm.
rocket ship on the angle. And there was an NWO in Japan, or a interpromotional type of angle in Japan.
Yeah.
Do you think without Hogan being involved in WCW, if he wasn't the third man and it was, say, Sting,
Yep.
as was rumored, or whomever, do you think it would have had the immediate impact and staying power that it did for a number of years?
Absolutely not. I'm very confident in saying that because I just don't think that it has the kind of. I mean, when he turned heel, it was a milestone moment. It was like a hallmark moment in wrestling history, and in many cases, like in the history of like people's childhoods, like as far as their consumption of entertainment, it was truly like a canon event when Hulk Hogan turns heel. And I remember being at a day camp the next day after that happened, and everyone is talking about this, and it is the water cooler discussion. It is the biggest thing that was going on probably in all of entertainment at that time. And if it was anyone else, I don't think it would have made that same imprint because he was the biggest star in the history of wrestling at that point, right? WrestleMania 1, sold out so many arenas as the good guy, as the consummate babyface, the guy, say your vitamin, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, and train. And in one moment, he turned that on its head, and he turned into a villain. And people were not really expecting that, and that is what spurred that incredible visceral reaction from the fans at Ocean Center in Daytona, where again we were just discussing this. Everyone knew for the most part in that building that wrestling is predetermined, that it's a show, it's scripted, but it did not matter one bit when they were in that audience and they were throwing their garbage and their soda cups and their, hot dog wrappers into the ring. It was a real emotional response. And that is so hard to come by in wrestling. It's almost impossible to come by in wrestling now. Back then, it was a little bit easier because there was no internet and there wasn't as much knowledge of what was going on behind the scenes. So it was very much, of the moment. But if that was Sting, Jack, or if that was Lex Luger or someone like that as the third man, there is not that reaction. And there is not that
Shock.
there's not that shock, and there's not, I mean, and then, once that happened, it's like, well, what is going to happen next? And I'm not sure if there would have been that same feeling if it was someone else. I think it would have been a good wrestling angle, right? It would have been a good wrestling angle, good wrestling storyline. It would have lasted, a few months. But when it was Hogan, forget it. Then it was like, how long can we, ride this wave of, Hulk Hogan as the bad guy, and by the way, Hall and Nash there too, two of the cooler, more charismatic guys in all of wrestling who are still in their primes, behind him. That's really the key. I don't think the NWO. We're not talking about the NWO right now. There's no book, Jack. Unless it's Hogan, right?
Mm.
And it's really the combination of, and I've said it so many times, because there was that push and pull and conflict between, Nash and Hall and Hogan back in the '90s over kind of like the soul of the NWO. Who does it belong to? Who is the real leader? Who is the real, like, NWO? And the truth is, it's all three. It does not exist without the contributions of all three of them. There's no NWO to the level that it got and the level that it's still at, if not for Hall, Nash, and Hogan combined as a team. And that is a fact as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and this kind of dovetails nicely into my next question, and that's the fact that we've seen, since the NWO formation, their stables, there's really good stables. There,
Mm-hmm.
during around the same time, DX was out. We've
Yep.
seen the Shield, we've seen Evolution, we've seen countless stables that seem to either want to be a hybrid of the NWO and the Horsemen, or just plain NWO inspired groups.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see the cultural zeitgeist of the NWO and the way that it made everything mainstream? Despite people trying to recreate that, and the Paul Heyman, the new stable, whatever that is right now, I forget the
Mm-hmm.
name, they still go back to the well of stables. Do you ever
Yep.
see an NWO style phenomenon promulgating again?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I really don't. I don't see, because of the way that they blended, reality and fiction, and the way that they kind of went in and out of kayfabe in a way. I don't know if that could ever truly happen again. Now, I really thought they were onto something with the John Cena, Rock, Travis Scott thing. That was, to me, very reminiscent of the NWO because of how big those guys are as celebrities, even outside of wrestling. And I thought that was something that really could have broken through. But we have not seen The Rock since then, and we've only seen Travis Scott once. So it's really just been Cena carrying that. And it just never became something that the NWO did. So it's so hard. It's so hard. I mean, wrestling is very cyclical, and there could be a time, a moment in time where someone captures the imagination, or a group captures the imagination of the fan base. But I'm just not sure it will ever happen in the way that the NWO did. I think the Bloodline was incredible. I thought that was an incredible storyline, long term storyline. In many ways, I mean, in every way, written better than the NWO storyline, for longer, right? Um, and that's just because there was a plan. The NWO, there really was no plan beyond like a few months, and they had to kind of figure it out, and because it was working better than anyone ever imagined it would. And the Bloodline, there was definitely a plan, and they went through the steps. So I think that's the closest thing that we're gonna get, but there wasn't that same, like, Bloodline helped WWE's business. There's no doubt it lifted WWE's business, but not to the extent that the NWO changed the entire fortunes of WCW, at least for, a period of time until they couldn't figure out how to end it. And, again, it was It was kind of cumbersome there, in like '99 and beyond what was going on. But yeah, in a short answer, I don't see anything kind of capturing that in the same way.
Yeah, I agree completely. I think the NWO angle, because it was so organic, they kept adding members. I think that really
Hmm.
diluted
Hmm.
the whole deal, and I didn't think the infighting in the NWO worked particularly well. But before
Yeah.
we give the audience the information that they need as to where to get the book, I know you stated that it's available for pre-order and
Hmm.
keep up with all the things in your world. Otherwise, I noted that you referred to pro wrestling as the greatest art that America
Hmm.
has given the
Yes.
world. What what does this mean to you, and how do you hope, aside from being a bestseller, which I'm sure it's going to be, how do you see the book fitting into elevating the perception of wrestling as an art form?
Yeah. Great question. So I think let me pull back a little bit. So my feeling, and you mentioned that I've called, and I'm sure that I've probably gotten made fun of for saying this, that wrestling is the greatest art that America has given the world, and I truly feel that way because back in like during the contemporary time, Shakespeare was considered very lowbrow, like very lowbrow entertainment, and it was just for kind of like whatever the British equivalent of like rednecks was, white trash. And it was thought to be just kind of like a soap opera. And it was not really given any kind of respect during its time. And I feel like there's a lot of parallels between Shakespeare and wrestling. And I know that, again, I'm going to probably get made fun of by people who don't understand about this. And I don't care. I'm done. I'm done caring about that kind of stuff. I think that wrestling, the way that it can mirror reality and mirror what's going on in the real world, is unlike anything else that exists in entertainment. And I think that wrestling is almost like a regular social experiment, a sociological experiment, because multiple times a week, these men and women go in front of live crowds and they try to kind of get the live crowd to do what they want them to do, whether it's chant or cheer or boo. And the fans have a very big say with their voices about what is going on in the match or in that segment or in an interview or what have you, and about, in some cases, even the direction of where WWE is going. And we've seen that recently in WWE very clearly, just with the R-Truth stuff, where he gets released inexplicably, and no one can even understand why. Actually, not released. His contract was going to expire. I want to make sure that I, put that in the proper context. And immediately, fans start being vocal, not just on social media, but even in the buildings, chanting his name. And WWE listened, and they re-signed him, and they brought him back, and now this storyline with John Cena is continuing. Now, if there was no kind of backlash like that from fans, that was not the plan for WWE. They had to change their plans. Same thing happened last year at WrestleMania, right? The plan was going to be, you know, The Rock was going to take Cody Rhodes' spot and go up against Roman Reigns. Didn't really make a whole lot of sense. And the fans called WWE out on it. They were starting to boo The Rock, and they forced The Rock to turn heel and become like this final boss character, which made the lead up to WrestleMania even better than it probably was going to be if it was just The Rock versus Roman Reigns and, whatever Cody Rhodes was going to end up doing. So I don't think there's anything like that. And the way that it can, being a live show regularly is so beneficial to how, they communicate with their audience, because it's going on in real time, and the things that were happening in the news that day are almost part of like canon for wrestling, because it's real. I mean, it's live. I shouldn't say it's real, but it's real in the fact that these people are actually out there doing it in front of a crowd. It's not a show that, they shoot 13 episodes in December and doesn't run until like the next fall, or whatever. And you can't change, it's already done. It's shot, it's edited, it's post produced, and then it's ready to be aired. There's no changing the storyline based on what the fans are saying, on social media or, whatever. So I think in that way, wrestling is just an incredible art form. And even to go to like smaller shows, and I'm a big fan of independent wrestling, and I'm so interested in how independent wrestlers try to get over with the crowd, which is, for non-fans, that means like, get a reaction out of the crowd in some way, whether it's getting, cheered or booed. And I'm always just so interested in how they do that. What speaks to people, what makes people want to cheer or boo who are in the audience, right? What brings that out of them, because in most cases, if not in every case, you're at a show and you know that what you're watching, this is not who they really are. This is a character, and this is a scripted match. So how does that character, within the context of like this pseudo sport, how does that character get an emotional response from you? And it's not easy to do, but because these folks are so talented, they can do that. Whether it's in front of 50 people at, a small show here in Atlanta, Georgia, or if it's at WrestleMania in front of 70,000 people, they're able to get, a reaction out of the fans, and that is like an inherent talent that is translatable to other things. But there's not many people who can just go and do it in wrestling, right? It's translatable outside of wrestling, but not as translatable for someone coming into wrestling. Someone like Logan Paul already kind of had that ability because he was a social media content creator, which is basically just playing a character on social media, like, just like wrestling. And that's why I think it's the best art, because there's nothing like it. And as fake as the stigma might be, it's predetermined. To me, it's actually the most authentic art because of the live nature of it and the connection to the fans who are there live watching.
Mm-hmm. And their emotional responses that the whole point is to elicit.
Yes, yes. And how do you do that? And when I go to independent shows, I love to, and I bring people, like I try to share wrestling with as many people as I mean, as many people as I can. People like unsolicited, come watch wrestling with me. You know what I mean? Like I'm probably a little bit too aggressive, but after the show is over, whether they loved it or they hated it, I always ask them, who was the most compelling character to you? Who did you connect with? And it's different for everyone because everyone is different. Everyone is different, and one character might speak to them differently than others because it's a personal thing. And that, I think, is also kind of interesting and inherent to wrestling, is that there are other, the characters are relatable in different ways, because, and that's why I think it's sociological, because like who you like in wrestling is kind of a statement about who you are as a person. How you're acting, how you're behaving at a wrestling show, cheering, booing, or whatever. Like maybe you're someone who likes the heels. Well, what does that say about you? What does that say about who you are? I don't know, but I think it's sociological, and I find it endlessly fascinating.
It says that you're a nice person because everybody knows the heels are the nicest people in wrestling. Where can all the fans? I'm really looking forward to reading your book. Where can they get the copies, either advanced? When does it go on sale, etc.? And where can they find you on all the various socials?
Yeah. So the book is available right now in pre-order on Amazon, or really wherever you get books. So it's on Barnes and Noble. It's pretty much everywhere. It's on Target and Walmart in the States. Their websites right now. It'll be in store on June 24th. So that's the release date, June 24th. It's next Tuesday, and it should be available wide then. And then as far as my social media, uh, my Twitter is just at Marc Raimondi. The spelling is down there below. Let's see if I can. Okay, yes. Uh, and then my Instagram is the same with sports at the end. So it's Marc Raimondi Sports, same spelling. That's here. There we go. All right.
Roger. Well, Marc, I've thoroughly enjoyed this discussion. Really, again, looking forward to getting the book. Not only old school fans, but I think the newer fans will greatly enjoy that as well. And I wish you the best of luck with it. I'm for sure will be on the bestseller list, and best of luck in your upcoming tour.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, man.
Well, fans, that's it for this edition of the Cheap Heat Productions podcast. Make sure you like this video if you've enjoyed it and subscribe, and you won't miss any of this type of entertaining and informative content. Till next time, Jack Kilby here. Thanks for watching. Thank you for watching this video. Please give it a like if you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow us on all social media platforms at Cheap Heat Productions. Don't forget to hit the notification button